Here we go again.
No, not again.
You've been fooled.
How long have we been doing this?
Once more unto the bridge.
Again until we're both dead.
Hello and welcome to You've Seen It Before, movie reviews with connections in mind. Spider-Man Homecoming has finally hit theaters. It is the first solo venture of the latest incarnation of Spider-Man, played by Tom Holland, directed by John Watts. And in this story, we finally get to see what happened after the events of Captain America Civil War, where still in high school, Peter Parker is dealing with what it means to be a superhero, but still be a high school student. And of course, some stuff's going down in New York City with Michael Keaton as the Vulture doing nefarious things, and Tony Stark's Iron Man is trying to tamp it down, saying, Peter Parker, please, just leave it to the grown-ups, alright? But of course, he's not going to do that. Now, this movie review will contain spoilers of Spider-Man Homecoming, as well as certain other spoilers of other films as well. There will be a full list in the description below. And if you have not seen Spider-Man Homecoming yet, or any of the films listed below, and want to wait until you have, stop the video at this point and come back later. But with these things in mind, though, let's begin. So, Spider-Man Homecoming takes place 2 months after the events of Captain America Civil War. This is now in a world where Captain America is a war criminal, supposedly, and Tom Holland's Peter Parker is back in high school in New York City, and he's trying to deal with how to be a effective Spider-Man, and he's has aspirations of being more than just a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. He wants to be a full-fledged member of the Avengers initially, and of course he's been bugging Tony Stark and his faithful companion Happy Hogan, played by Jon Favreau. And of course, the events transpire, which brings into focus what Peter Parker's Spider-Man can do, mainly the event activities of Michael Keaton's Vulture, who is selling illegal weapons made from the wreckage of the Chitauri invasion after the events of the first Avengers film. And of course, he's keen to keep selling these weapons, but Tom Holland's Spider-Man is saying no to that. And we get a movie in which we get to explore what it means to be Spider-Man, what it means to still be a high school Peter Parker, and as Tony Stark said in the trailers, if Peter Parker is something without the special suit that he gave him during the events of Captain America Civil War. Now, there are several things that this movie resembles from films that have come before it, so let's start with the obvious ones and go from there. First, most obviously, it cannot be ignored that this is the third incarnation of Spider-Man in the last 20 years or so, starting with Tobey Maguire's amazing portrayal of Spider-Man in the first Spider-Man film from 2002. And we've also seen Andrew Garfield's take on the superhero from 2012's The Amazing Spider-Man, and its sequel as well. So of course there are going to be some comparisons as to how Tom Holland's portrayal of the character stacks up against those two. And in this film, there are a couple of places where the Tom Holland's Spider-Man matches up perfectly against the other two Spider-Man franchises that have come before. Now, normally I don't like to compare franchises and franchise reboots that have come before. Example, which would be Ghostbusters, in which it's going to be obvious that they're going to reference that thing that had come before. But of course, these are these three separate franchises now, each take place within their own separate universes. Whereas in something like a James Bond franchise, where it's still the same character throughout and it's the same timeline throughout, and you can get little nuggets of character reference from other previous films in there, you expect that to a certain extent. Then these are intentional callbacks to those other franchises in order to pay respect to what those characters have done. First off, the Tobey Maguire franchise, which is the first cinematic franchise that's come out for Spider-Man. There's a reference to the second film in that trilogy, Spider-Man 2, in which this is a shot teased in the trailers of Spider-Man Homecoming, in which Tom Holland's Spider-Man is seen slinging a whole bunch of webs in between various pillars of the Staten Island ferry that has been sliced in half by Vulture, and he's straining at these webs in order to keep these two halves together. Now, this is very reminiscent of the iconic train scene in Spider-Man 2 from 2004, in which Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man has to stop a runaway train from crashing off the edge of the track, and he ends up slinging a whole bunch of webs onto the buildings on either side of the track, and there's that iconic shot of him grabbing onto these webs and just straining with all of his strength in order to stop this train, which eventually he does. As, of course, Spider-Man maybe would have been able to hold them together at some point, but of course, Tom Holland's Spider-Man has to have the help of Iron Man in order to save the people on the Staten Island ferry. Now, there's also an additional callback to Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man pair of films, in which there's a scene with Tom Holland's Spider-Man in the Washington Monument, in which a piece of Chitauri energy core is going unstable. It eventually unleashes a burst of energy which wreaks havoc on the Washington Monument. It cracks the monument itself, but it also brings down the elevator, which Peter Parker's high school academic decathlon team is stuck in now, and the elevator is about to fall down, and the safeties are failing, and most of the team ends up getting rescued safely, but Liz Allen, who is Tom Holland's Peter Parker's love interest in Spider-Man Homecoming, ends up being the last one to get off, and she doesn't get off quite as easily, and Spider-Man has to sling the web down the elevator shaft in order to save her. Now, this is very reminiscent of The Amazing Spider-Man 2 with Andrew Garfield, in which Gwen Stacy, played by Emma Stone, is falling down the clock tower in the finale, and Andrew Garfield's Spider-Man has to sling the web in order to save her. Now, of course, as we may know, that rescue did not go quite that well. Liz Allen ends up living to tell the tale, whereas Gwen Stacy met a more neck-snapping fate, unfortunately. So, but they're the two most prominent callbacks to the previous two Spider-Man incarnations that we've had in the modern age of superhero films. Now, this is also, with Spider-Man Homecoming, this is the first Spider-Man film that is now officially in the MCU, but it's a cooperative venture between Marvel Studios and Sony, who still owns the rights to Spider-Man, and they exclusively produced and shot and distributed the films for the previous two franchises. Now they can have a deal where Spider-Man is now officially in the MCU. Now, of course, there's a great callback to another film in the MCU franchise, mainly coming from the fact that Peter Parker in this film is, as you expect, is a high school sophomore, and as such, he starts out as being a very immature, cocky superhero, and he likes to want to prove himself, and he ends up taking on more than he can chew, and he ends up getting his fancy suit taken away from him by Iron Man, and he has to prove to Iron Man, Tony Stark, that he is more than just what the suit makes him. And by film's end, of course, he proves that he is a decent human being and he is capable of being a great superhero. And by film's end, Tony Stark actually offers him a chance to become a full-fledged Avenger. But Peter Parker actually turns him down. He actually says that he could do more good being a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man, which shocks everyone. But so the progression goes from a very immature Peter Parker to a more wizened and aware of his limitations but willing to grow and mature before taking on greater responsibility Spider-Man. Now, this is very reminiscent to what we've seen as a character arc in the MCU's portrayal of Thor, Chris Hemsworth's character, in which both films, mainly Thor and Thor the Dark World, we see a very immature and cocky Prince of Asgard who ends up doing more damage than he really intended to. He ends up having his powers taken away from him, and he has to prove to Odin that he is a decent Asgardian, and he ends up sacrificing himself to save the people of the town of New Mexico. And that ends up getting his powers restored to him. And in Thor the Dark World, by the finale, we see that Odin, of course, we know that it's actually Loki in disguise as Odin, but in the scene, it's depicted as Odin offering Thor the chance to become the rightful heir of Asgard and hand down the role of ruler of Asgard to Thor, but Thor actually turns Odin down, saying that he would do more good the way he is rather than be given more responsibility. Finally, John Watts, the director, has stated that it was his intention to create a very high school drama feel reminiscent of the 80s films of John Hughes with Spider-Man Homecoming. And indeed, there are very many aspects of Spider-Man Homecoming that are centered on the high school aspects of Peter Parker, and that's a very refreshing change from the other Spider-Man films that we've come before it. Most notably, since John Hughes films are referenced most often in comparisons, we have to acknowledge the influence of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, which was one of John Hughes' more famous high school drama films. And there's a couple of different instances where it's Spider-Man Homecoming is evoking Ferris Bueller's Day Off. One is very literally where they recreate a scene from Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and they actually show that same clip from the film in which Spider-Man is chasing a pair of Vulture's henchmen who are selling illegal weapons through this suburban neighborhood. And since it's a suburban neighborhood and there are no high-rises, in order for Spider-Man to use web sling and swing through the streets, he has to run through the neighborhood and generally cause havoc. Very reminiscent of the ending of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, where Ferris has to run through the backyards of his various neighbors in order to get home before his parents do. And of course, that's the scene that is shown on a TV pool party, which Spider-Man crashes. So that was a little on the nose, but hey, that's a great reference. Awesome. And of course, there's the end credit scene which is very evocative of the theme of Ferris Bueller's Day Off. And if you have not seen Spider-Man Homecoming yet, I'm not actually going to spoil what the end credit scene is. There's actually a mid-credit scene with Vulture in prison, but there's also a scene at the very end of the credits, which I don't want to spoil because it kind of ruins the joke. But I will give you a hint. If you have seen Deadpool and wait until the very end to see Deadpool's end credit scene, then you have a basic idea of what kind of end credit scene is down there. So there you have it. There are the main points of comparison between Spider-Man Homecoming and films that have come before it. Of course, there are probably others. I'm not perfect. There's some others. If you've noticed any similarities, you can note them down in the description below. But all of this boils down to whether or not you should see this film. And of course, I'm going to say absolutely go see this film for a couple of reasons. One, this may be somewhat cynical, but if the MCU has been going on since 2008, and this is an MCU film, and if you're not invested, if you're invested this far into the MCU film, you're kind of sticking along for the ride. You've still got Black Panther and Infinity War and Avengers 4 to go, so that at the very least. Oh, and Captain Marvel as well. So yeah, you still got a long ways to go before you finish the MCU, so you might as well watch this one too. But more than that, I would say if you're a fan of Spider-Man as a whole, if you're like me and you grew up with Tobey Maguire's version of Spider-Man, like that was the greatest version of Spider-Man ever. It kicked off the superhero renaissance of superhero films, and we grew up with those films. Tobey Maguire was our Spider-Man, and Andrew Garfield, while good, he was not quite up to the task of replacing Tobey Maguire's films. But with Tom Holland's Spider-Man, if you saw Captain America Civil War, you'll know that his portrayal is gold, and it is worth seeing for both his Spider-Man quippiness and action scenes, but also his heartfelt scenes when he's just Peter Parker in high school trying to confront the girl he loves and trying to negotiate with his friend Ned, who accidentally learns his secret identity, and trying to humor and integrate him as best he can into his life, but also saying, no, this is something I have to do on my own. These are the conflicts that we wanted to see in a Spider-Man film, and it's something that plays out very well. And this is a very funny film, mostly in part to Tom Holland. And for all these reasons, I would say definitely go see this film. If there are any negatives that I can bring into critique of this film, I would say that there are a couple scenes where it does kind of drag a little bit. There are some scenes where some of the dialogue is just a little too cheesy, and if at a certain point it does feel a little long, but all in all, I would say these are fairly minor critiques. Overall, I would say this is a very entertaining film. A major caveat, not necessarily on par with the Tobey Maguire Spider-Man films. For me, at least, those are irreplaceable. Spider-Man 3, of course, but yeah, it's still part of it. But as a Spider-Man film goes, this is definitely worthy of your attention. Go see this film. I would say, yes, you should definitely go see this film, and don't let any comparisons to previous films not affect your enjoyment of this film. So there you have it. There's my review of Spider-Man Homecoming. I hope you enjoyed it. I appreciate whatever audience I can get. And this actually starts off the very busy July movie month for me. Next week will be War for the Planet of the Apes, coming out July 14th. After that will be Dunkirk, which I'm very excited for, being a student of World War II history, coming out July 21st. And July 28th will be Atomic Blonde with Charlize Theron. There are a couple of wild cards in there. I still have yet to see Baby Driver, and I probably should do that and do a review for that. I'm still kind of on the fence as to whether or not I want to do a review for Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets, but if I do, I will post those to my channel as well. So, thank you all for watching, and just remember, there's nothing new under the sun, and yes, you have seen it before. So, thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thank you.